I'm happy to come to you today with another Medscape article that led to a facepalm. As usual, this is just an opinion. I'm not practicing medicine right now and I'm not licensed as a physician, but I do have a background in psychiatry and I have a lot of opinions. The article that's triggering this video today is called, "What If We've Been Wrong About How ADHD Drugs Work?" I'm not going to get into the details of the neuroimaging and the conceptual nitty-gritty of what's happening here. Long story short is that there was a recent study in the journal Cell that looked at a large amount of fMRI data to get a big picture, connectivity, and network view of how stimulants affect the brain. Then they were surprised to find that stimulants have little effect on the actual attentional networks and instead are more directly impacting the reward and arousal networks of the brain. There's also a piece about sleep that's important where people taking stimulants had the brain of a person who had slept well. So in the Medscape article, they're basically saying that what we thought was an attention deficit was actually that kids did not want to engage that task. Hallelujah. It was not something they were interested in, they were bored, and we're basically forcing them to do things that are not aligned with their inner compass. They're integrating this with the fact that ADHD notably does not mean that kids cannot focus at all. They just don't focus on certain things, and then if it's something they're actually interested in, they can be hyper-focused. Wow. Thinking of it as a motivational issue makes sense of that as well. Notably, it is not new to think of the reward and motivational systems of the brain when thinking about ADHD. And to me, the fact that the attentional networks were not active in this study does not necessarily mean that the medications didn't have an effect on them, because all of the data used in this study are from the resting state, which means that tasks are not being engaged. There's an argument to be made that attentional networks are going to be dormant when you're not engaging a task. That's why, to me, this is mostly a conceptual shift, but the facepalm is because many people who were opposed to the diagnoses and the medications and were seen as anti-system or anti-science are being vindicated in a huge way right now, even though it's coming from a place of naivete. I'll still take the side of being grateful that this progress is happening. So what does this mean in terms of the larger issue of psychiatry and medicine in the modern world and the consciousness-based paradigm that I envision? One of the main issues that this highlights is that the current psychiatric diagnostic system is completely devoid of any explanation other than biological ones. Of course, there is research into adverse childhood events and psychosocial reasons that might contribute to mental illnesses, but there's an unspoken consensus that these are peripheral issues and that the substance of what's going on is going to be found in the brain and in the molecular description of events. No explanation other than brain-based molecular explanations are deemed to be valid, when in actuality, none of these biological mechanisms that we're talking about are causes of anything. They're just reflections of something that's going on that is not being talked about at all. In this case with ADHD, the fact that our society is built in a way that works against human nature, does not support individual traits and learning patterns, does not take into account the extremely different individual needs of children, especially in this day and age, and assumes that the student or the child is failing at being a good member of society when it can't or does not assimilate into the existing status quo. I know for a fact from myself that I've only started really learning things after my 30s, when I had the space and time to do it the way that my mind needs it to be. Everything else was forced, swallowed, and tried to be integrated with extreme emotional and intellectual conflict. Now I have the space to ask the questions that come to my mind because of how my particular mind works, and I have reason to believe that every individual is extremely complex and different from one another when it comes to how their spirit works through their body, and therefore how their brain interacts with the external world and information. So this is just the example of ADHD. There's the issue of adult ADHD and what that actually is. That's a whole separate topic. I won't get into it, but it's just one more way that human beings have developed their defenses against the way things are in society right now. It is also an overused diagnosis in many cases that dilute the actual meaning of the term. All this to say that every diagnosis in psychiatry has an issue around it like the one I'm describing with ADHD. Each one is slightly different, but it does boil down to outdated definitions that come from a time where humanity had to suppress most of its inner truth, emotional truths, the reality of what's actually going on, and keep it unconscious, and then have these definitions on the surface that are built to maintain and control a way of being that in our current times is becoming more and more untenable and unsustainable. Or in other words, we need a new diagnostic system. And a new diagnostic system for psychiatry would be the foundation of a new medical paradigm, because it is a part of the consciousness-based perspective that most, if not almost all, physical diseases, or what are called organic diseases, are also stemming from psychospiritual ailments that are not even close to being able to be addressed in the modern world. But again, this is changing. It's not going to be an option anymore. It's being forced into our awareness, and we're going to have to address it eventually. I'm going to close with a clarifier because this is one of the main things that comes up when the current system is critiqued. The question of being anti-medication specifically. I want to clarify that even as I say that I don't agree with much of how we're defining things, I'm still not anti-medication. If we have a system that incorporates what I see as the higher truths about human nature and how human beings work, then I'm all for using biological interventions in addition to other ones in a precise way, knowing what we're addressing and knowing what the root cause is, and helping alleviate suffering from that point of view. In other words, I'm just against coming at it from the wrong paradigm, because then we make mistakes, we overdo things, we use blunt instruments for very delicate issues, and maybe most importantly, we perpetuate false belief systems that lead to disempowerment, a learned helplessness, and a sense of lack of control or agency in people. Once we get things right there, then of course, intervening biologically or chemically can absolutely be a part of healthy treatment. That is my opinion. See you at the next one.